good to be able to it's really good to be able to come together when and however we can to focus on learning and sharing, working out what we need to do to make things better, particularly for this group of children and young people. And I just want to recognise that it's difficult at the moment for all of us to focus, I think. So I really appreciate you coming. I know we've got lots of worries and concerns about the awful situation in Ukraine. ECPAT UK has been providing a periodic overview of child trafficking in the UK since 2010, and we're delighted this year to produce it jointly with the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. The report brings together what we know, highlights the need for more data and information, and also highlights progress, but also urges action through a series of recommendations. And I'm going to hand over to our co-authors to tell you more about that now. We're going to have presentations from April McCroig, who is the Victims and Partnership Lead for the Office of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and from our Policy and Research Officer, Laura Durán, and the youth artist TB, who provided the amazing artwork for the report. So thank you, April. I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Patricia. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for joining on what is also for me a sunny Friday afternoon, and hopefully some of you have got something tasty for lunch that you can tuck into at the same time as we provide you a bit of an overview about this research report. So as already mentioned, my name is April McCroig and I'm the Victims and Partnerships Lead working at the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office. So for anyone who's not already aware, the Anti-Slavery Commissioner is a role that's provided by Part 4 of the Modern Slavery Act. The Commissioner has a UK-wide remit, and that's to encourage good practice in the prevention, detection and investigation of modern slavery offences, and also in the identification of victims. So the current Commissioner is Dame Sarah Thornton, and she has 4 strategic priorities that are set out in her strategic plan. So the first of those is around improving victim care and support. So that's predominantly my policy area, with that focus around victims and partnership working. The second priority is supporting law enforcement and prosecutions. The third priority is focusing on prevention. And the fourth is around getting value from research and innovation. So recognising that there's quite a bit of academic research that goes on in relation to modern slavery, but really trying to encourage that to have an impact on policy and practice. So Patricia's already mentioned that this year the Child Trafficking Snapshot report was a collaborative piece between ECPAT and between the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office. It was a really great opportunity to be able to work in partnership to bring together this piece. So I think I'll try and keep an eye on time. I think I've got about 20 minutes or so today, just to provide you with a bit of an overview of some of the key highlights from the report, and then I'll hand over to Laura, who will do the same from her side. So I just wanted to start off with some of the data. So part of the Child Trafficking Snapshot report is to bring together some of the data and evidence that is out there in relation to child trafficking. So hopefully you'll be able to see on your screen a slide that just gives some of the data on the quarterly referrals that are made into the National Referral Mechanism in the context of children. So this looks at referrals over time from 2017-18 right through to 2020 and 2021. So what we've seen over the past year that helped to inform the snapshot report was really that despite the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of child victims being referred into the National Referral Mechanism remains high. So last year there were 43.5% of all referrals were for child victims, and that compares only very slightly in difference, 42.7% in the previous year. So almost half of all victims referred into the National Referral Mechanism are children. So in Q2, you might be able to see that on the chart there. I'm not sure how small it is for people, but you'll actually see for the first time, Q2 of 2020, there were more children than adults who were referred into the National Referral Mechanism. So we also know that in some cases during the pandemic that exploitation of children has continued, and for some practitioners the changing in working practices did actually enable time to reflect on some cases and help to encourage more referrals being made into the system as awareness of the National Referral Mechanism has increased. So next slide, please. So this chart just gives a breakdown of the nationalities that we saw referred into the national referral mechanism last year. So you'll see that the vast majority of referrals were for UK nationals, and that was actually the same as the previous year as well. You'll also see in that top 10 nationalities, Vietnamese nationals, Romanian nationals, Albanian nationals, and also a number of nationalities that we do see associated with children who are presenting as unaccompanied asylum seekers. I guess what I would say, and the kind of caveat with some of this data as well, is this is obviously those cases identified and where there are potential victims. It's not going to be a kind of a true and a full reflection, because there are sadly still some cases where child victims of trafficking are not identified. Next slide, please. So this table just gives this chart, sorry, just gives you a breakdown of the exploitation types of those children who have been referred into the national referral mechanism. So you'll see the vast majority of cases are linked to criminal exploitation, followed by those who are exploited in multiple ways, then sexual exploitation and forced labour. So you do see that there is a significant proportion of referrals being made for criminal exploitation. I guess one caveat that I would place on this data is, at the moment in the UK, there is quite a lot of focus and attention on criminal exploitation, and this is being reflected somewhat in the data. But that is what we saw in terms of the referrals being made into the system last year. Next slide, please. So I've just included some data here taken from the snapshot report on the decisions being made within the national referral mechanism. So for those of you who are familiar with this system, you'll know that there is a two-stage decision process. So the reasonable grounds decision is that first stage decision, and the conclusive grounds decision is made on those cases where individuals have received a positive reasonable grounds decision. So the vast majority of decisions for children are positive. So at the reasonable ground stage, 95% of decisions last year were positive, and at the conclusive grounds stage decision, 99% of those decisions were positive. So this is a higher figure than we do see in the cases of adults. However, whilst we know that this is the picture in terms of the positive rate of decisions, children are waiting an extremely long time for decisions on their trafficking cases. Which can have a range of implications. So right from kind of the interaction between the national referral mechanism and other systems that children and young people might be involved in. So for example, the asylum system, but also the impact on individuals and their mental health, and children and young people who might be in that kind of that period of limbo where they're waiting for decisions on their cases. So in 2020, the overall median amount of time for a conclusive grounds decision, this is right across the board, not just for children, but for children and adults, the median amount of time was over 400 days for a decision. So children are waiting a long time in this system. There has been some work and some really encouraging developments in relation to a pilot looking at alternative decision-making models for child victims of trafficking, which I'll provide a little bit more detail on later on. But it was just to give you some of this data at this point around the decisions that are being made in the system. So I think that's it in terms of my slides for now, but I just wanted to, in the rest of the time that I've got left, touch on a few key sections of the report. So the first is around prosecutions. The second is around the key policy developments that relate to victim identification. And the third is around the key policy developments relating to safeguarding and support for child victims of trafficking. So first of all, prosecutions. The report highlights that although police activity in this area has continued to grow, the number of prosecutions remain low. We did include in the report some data from the Crown Prosecution Service, which looked at modern slavery offences and cross-referenced those with child abuse flagged offences. But what we did really find as part of this work is actually there are some data gaps in terms of the prosecutions that are specifically related to child victims of trafficking. And this actually led to one of the recommendations made by the review, in that it encouraged greater publication of data that disaggregates between children and adults in the context of prosecutions. The section of the report also outlines work from the Commissioner and our office on the Section 45 statutory defence. So this was a piece of work that was informed by a call for evidence back in 2020, which received over 100 responses that referred to over 200 case examples. the majority of those were linked to drug trafficking cases. So this piece of work primarily set out to look at the legal application of the defence and how it was working in practice. But actually one of the really kind of substantial findings was around child victims of trafficking and the sometimes insufficient safeguarding response to children in response. So the report made a series of practical recommendations aimed at a range of stakeholders. And one of those was actually for the Department for Education to update working together statutory guidance in order to better reflect the circumstances of children who were being subject to extrafamilial harm and child criminal exploitation. Something that we found through some of the examples submitted to the call for evidence demonstrated cases where young people were being referred into the national referral mechanism on more than one occasion, that there were kind of escalating concerns, escalating violence in that period, and also demonstrated to some extent a lack of knowledge and awareness around what the national referral mechanism means in the context of children and young people. So the report just gives you a little bit of an overview of that piece of work. It also reflects on 3 relevant court judgments that have taken place over the last year. So DPP versus M, R versus Bracani, and VCL and AN versus the UK. It highlights the updated guidance from the Crown Prosecution Service and how really the national referral mechanism interacts with the criminal justice system. It also highlights some examples of good practice. So it refers to Operation Orochi. That's a Metropolitan Police-led initiative that essentially uses telecoms data and analysis of digital devices to inform prosecutions rather than being reliant on victim testimony. They've actually seen some quite promising results in relation to this work in the Metropolitan Police Service. And since it was first introduced in November 2019, they have had, so it's 21 defendants who have been charged with 38 modern slavery offences, and that's specifically in relation to child victims, and they have seen 10 convictions to date. So that's some encouraging work that is going on at the moment. This section of the report also refers to slavery and trafficking risk orders, slavery and trafficking prevention orders. So these are 2 civil orders that were introduced under the Modern Slavery Act, and it highlights a case study from Avon and Somerset Police where they've been able to secure a slavery and trafficking prevention order. So that was in the context of an individual who had received a 7-year and 2-month sentence for criminally exploiting a 15-year-old young person. So in addition to that custodial sentence, they also were given a 10-year slavery and trafficking prevention order, so that once they are released from prison, they will be subject to the conditions imposed by that order. So they relate to how the individual, that essentially their access to a mobile phone, but also prohibiting their contact with those under 18 and their ability to arrange transport or to book accommodation for those who are under 18. So helping to reduce the impact of harm in the longer term. So the second area that I just wanted to touch on today is in relation to policy developments linked to victim identification. So as we've already heard about today, the numbers of children being referred into the National Referral Mechanism is increasing, which to some extent reflects heightened awareness among practitioners, but actually there is still far more work to be done. So over the past year, we, alongside ECPAT UK, have been supporting some work being undertaken by the Bakita Centre at the University of St Mary's University in Twickenham to produce a training standards framework for child trafficking. So this is very much based on the model that already exists for adult victims of modern slavery, but it essentially looks at the skills and the knowledge that practitioners need to respond to modern slavery, specifically to child victims, looking at the different tiers of knowledge that individuals might need. So it goes through from tier 1 right through to tier 3, and it also has a specific focus on county lines and criminal exploitation within that as well. So this has been a kind of a multi-agency and a collaborative piece in its production, and will be launched as part of a virtual event, which is at the end of next month. So hopefully some of you will be able to join that and think about how you might be able to embed those standards within your organisation. So I also wanted to touch upon the Home Office pilot for devolved NRM decision making for children. So this is a really, really exciting piece of work, and the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and ECPAT UK have both publicly made calls for decision making for children in the context of the national referral mechanism to have much greater local engagement. So we were really pleased in the summer of 2020 when we were approached by the Home Office to help support some stakeholder engagement sessions to really start to unpick some of the challenges and answer some of the questions that local authorities and other safeguarding partners might have. And that in the spring of 2021, the Home Office launched a competitive grant process to identify areas to be involved in a pilot. So in June 2021, the Home Office announced that 10 areas would be involved in this devolved decision-making pilot, and they included local authority areas across England, Scotland and Wales. So these areas are all testing a variety of different approaches to local decision-making, but I guess one of the kind of fundamental parts of this pilot is that decisions will be made by local safeguarding partners, so including local authorities, police and health representatives, as well as any other agencies that local area might see fit in line with the model that they've developed. So both our office and ECPAT UK have been involved in an expert advisory panel to help inform the evaluation of this work. And what we've really tried to emphasise and encourage is for the evaluation not only to look at the impact on the operational process of decision making within the national referral mechanism, but also its impact on children. And I think appreciating that it's difficult to look at longer term outcomes because of the kind of the short term nature of the pilot, actually thinking about what the impact of the pilot is on those short term and those medium term safeguarding outcomes for children. So it's been a really good opportunity to work with the Home Office on this pilot and to help inform some of their thinking. So the pilot is still in the early stages. I don't know if anyone on the call here today is involved in the pilots at all, but some of the feedback we've heard from practitioners so far has suggested that the pilots have helped to streamline the process for information gathering to help inform that decision-making process. Also that it's led to increased awareness of actually the national referral mechanism process and what it means in the context of children and young people. And also that it's led to a reduction in the average time taken for NRM decisions to be made. So I mentioned earlier, looking at that 2020 data, the average median amount of time for decisions to be made was over 400 days. In the pilot areas, they have a requirement to make a reasonable grounds decision. So that's that first stage decision within 45 days, and to make that second conclusive grounds decision within a further 45 days. But in the pilot areas, there is the ability to make both of those decisions within a first meeting if there is sufficient information available. So obviously that timescale is vastly different to the over 400 days median average in the rest of the country, where the Home Office is making those decisions. So that's a really exciting policy development and something that we've been supporting, and we're really keen to see the findings of when that evaluation comes to fruition. So finally, I just wanted to touch on another section of the report that looks at key developments in relation to safeguarding and supporting child victims of trafficking. So the report reflects on some of the challenges in supporting children and young people who are subject to extrafamilial harm. So it refers to the serious case review in the case of Jacob from Oxfordshire, who was a young person criminally exploited. So it notes that working together to safeguard children's statutory guidance confirms that Section 47 inquiries should be carried out where there are concerns about all forms of abuse and neglect, and specifically refers to extrafamilial threats such as criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation. But it acknowledged that there are quite clearly some difficulties in its application. It goes on to provide some examples of some good practice that has been developed in this area. So, for example, around contextual safeguarding approaches as developed by Carleen Furman, thinking about those wider contexts and how children's social care need to work with wider individuals and organisations that have influence and impact within those social contexts that can help with child protection and safeguarding. It provides a case study of a 15-year-old who'd been criminally exploited, and thinking about contextual safeguarding approaches, looking at not only the area he was residing, but also the area where he liked to hang out with his friends. Looking at his household makeup and actually finding that his mother was not only a victim of domestic abuse, but had also been exploited herself criminally as well. It then goes on to talk about the response and how this young person was happy when working with his uncle at his garage, and how that fed into the wider responses from children's social care and other safeguarding partners. The section of the report also refers to the Tackling Child Exploitation programme. So this is a consortium funded by the Department for Education, and is made up of support from research in practice, from the Children's Society, and also the University of Bedfordshire, to look at supporting areas in developing their strategic responses to extrafamilial harm. So if anyone's not already familiar with this, there is quite a comprehensive website that's been set up by the Tackling Child Exploitation programme, which has links to a lot of resources and materials that you might find helpful. And just finally, the section of the report also highlights the work being undertaken through Operation Inersta. So this is a project led by the Modern Slavery and Organised Immigration Crime Programme, and is very much around ensuring a more effective multi-agency response to unaccompanied migrant children. So this response is much about early engagement with young people in order to build rapport, but also about getting photographs and wet fingerprints so that they can be utilised. So they're stored on immigration systems, but they can be then utilised if the young person goes missing at a later date. So that's an example of work that's being undertaken, that's been led by law enforcement, but is very much a multi-agency approach and focus. So just, I guess, the last few points from me. This section of the report also reflects on the independent various guardianship services that exist. So the Independent Child Trafficking Guardianship Service in England and Wales. So this, over the past year, has been rolled out to a further 1/3 of all local authority areas. So the total coverage across England and Wales is now that this service is available in 2/3 of local authority areas. So whilst we're encouraged by this continued rollout, actually this provision was a provision of the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. So it is disappointing that there are still young people who aren't able to access this service. Over the past year, in line with that continued rollout, the model is also testing 3 of the recommendations made by the independent review of the Modern Slavery Act. So that is around removing the 18-month limit on support, offering support to those over 18 years of age for those who need it, and also around children who are not unaccompanied but have a figure of parental responsibility in the UK, for them being able to access the direct support worker model. So those mechanisms are all being tested as part of this continued rollout. The section also refers to the Scottish Guardianship Service, which we know has just been subject to an evaluation. And it also refers to the Independent Guardian Service in Northern Ireland, and just provides some data from these areas, but also some of their reflections around the key challenges and progress being made in relation to supporting child victims of trafficking. So I will leave things there and hand over to Laura just to give a bit of a summary on other aspects of the report, and we'll come back for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, April. And yes, just to remind everybody that we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you want to start posing any questions for us to consider for the end of the session for the Q&A, please do put those in either the chat box or in the Q&A box, so that both April and myself, or maybe you might have a question for TB later on about her art, we can pick those up at the end. So I'm going to be talking about specifically 2 sections of the report which focus on the issue of transitions to adulthood and the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is an imminent issue presenting imminent barriers for this group of children currently in Parliament. So, apologies. So the main features of transitions to adulthood that I wanted to focus on today is the use of unregulated accommodation for 16 and 17-year-old children. So some of the things we cover in the report is that obviously this form of accommodation has been linked in multiple reports, and there's quite a bit of evidence showing that children who are placed in unregulated accommodation are at higher risk of being victims of exploitation or other forms of harm. Unregulated accommodation at the moment is disproportionately used to accommodate unaccompanied children who are seeking asylum. And this form for accommodation really has seen children being completely unsupported in very precarious conditions. So, for example, in the beginning of the pandemic and then subsequently in 2021, we did see a lot of children struggling in when they were in isolation or in previous lockdowns as the year transitioned, who had absolutely no support in this type of accommodation. As part of a review, the government did go ahead and completely ban the use of unregulated accommodation for anybody under the age of 16. And those regulations came into force in the summer of 2021, as is covered in the report. But unfortunately, that still does not provide any relief for 16 and 17-year-olds who are effectively left without care. The Department for Education did set out views around particular standards that they wanted to hold for those organizations that do provide unregulated accommodation, either those who are providing this form of accommodation on a for-profit basis or those who are not for profit. And these standards, I suppose we can say, are better than having no standards at all, but they remain still completely inadequate to address some of the really significant issues that children are facing in this form of accommodation. So we are supporting our colleagues at Article 39, who did launch a legal challenge around the discrimination that is being faced by 16 and 17-year-olds. And that case was recently heard in the High Court. So we didn't cover that in our report because obviously the decision on that we are still awaiting. So beyond some of these issues that 16 and 17-year-olds who are child victims of trafficking in care are facing, obviously there's the other issue around turning 18. So for those who are looked after, we do see this transition to adulthood sometimes not being a great source of joy for many children, but rather it can be a source for despair. This is particularly in the case for children who still have an irregular immigration status, when at the point of 18, depending on their own situation, they might increasingly become more fearful of particular immigration enforcement measures, such as immigration detention or removal. Also, we see a lot of the support that children would have received within care substantially reduced as care leavers. And obviously that's an issue that a lot of young people talk to us about. So really these transitions to adulthood, depending on the case of many children, particularly those who are still in that kind of immigration limbo, can be a huge source of despair. So with that in mind, we can turn our attention to some of the very critical issues that will completely change the legislative landscape for children going through the NRM, as are proposed in the Nationality and Borders Bill. So I wanted to start by saying that even though the process around this bill began early last year with the publishing of the new plan for immigration by the Home Office, and then the subsequent legislative process in Parliament, as the bill has been discussed in the Commons and in the House of Lords, we still do not have child's rights impact assessment on this bill. That's really unfortunate, because obviously a child's rights impact assessment would assist different government departments to evaluate the proposals that are set out in this bill and the impact that those would have in line with the government's obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we are still pressuring for this to be carried out and for it to be published so that we can all access this assessment and see what considerations the government has taken regarding their obligations under the convention. So I'm going to focus specifically on the parts of the bill with regards to modern slavery, which are set out in part 5. And I will be speaking also a little bit about part 4, but obviously the bill as a whole poses a lot of very challenging situations for children, especially those with irregular immigration status. So for all child victims of trafficking who are claiming asylum or have a human rights application, there will be a new procedure that will be introduced as part of the NRM, which will be a slavery and trafficking information notice. We don't know exactly how this procedure will work or at what point in the NRM there will be a requirement for children to submit further information as part of this notice. But the penalty for not abiding by this information notice can be a damage of the child's credibility. So this particular clause is very troubling within the context of children because, as many of you in the call will know, child trafficking is a form of child abuse. And we really never have come across any form of child abuse that forces children to disclose within a specified period of time or be penalized for it and have other consequences in different procedures, such as the asylum procedure, if they fail to disclose within that specified period of time. So this is very, very troubling for children. We all know, and particularly all of you who currently work in local authorities as social workers and children's services will know how challenging disclosure can be for children, for all child victims of abuse. But specifically, all the evidence regarding disclosure of child victims of trafficking has shown us that it often comes in small drips as a child begins to develop a significant relationship of trust with an adult, and they feel really secure to be able to disclose some of the abuse that they've endured. So for there to be a specific requirement on children, pressuring them to disclose their abuse within a specified period of time or phase not being believed, we find this truly a truly shocking development. And it really goes against a lot of the really positive steps that the government has taken, such as the one that April has discussed on the devolved NRM and other really positive steps for child victims to really be seen within the context of child protection. Now, additionally to this slavery and trafficking notice, we have what was said to be in the new plan for immigration as an increase in the reasonable grounds threshold. Now, ECPAT UK is very, very concerned about this because the threshold isn't specified in the bill, so we really don't know what that threshold will be. For those of you that have referred children into the NRM or have worked with children going through the NRM, you'll be aware that that threshold currently is at very low. It's a very low threshold. It's I suspect but cannot prove, and that's set out in statutory modern slavery guidance, and it has been the case pretty much since the NRM came into being following the ratification of the European Convention on trafficking. And there's a reason why the reasonable grounds threshold is very low. Often that decision is meant to be made within 5 days of a child being referred. And in most cases of child trafficking, it could be that, for example, a children is being referred because there's indicators that this child has been trafficked, but not necessarily a substantial amount of evidence to suggest that this is the case. And the NRM is designed in that way so that there's a low barrier at the entry point to then enable that security that facilitates disclosure through the reflection and recovery period, to then be able to gather all the relevant information to go ahead and then make that conclusive grounds decision. But unfortunately, if that threshold is raised, and as I said before, we don't know what that will be raised to, that could disqualify children at the entry point. And it could be that we would be disqualifying children who are victims, but the necessary evidence might not have been available at that stage in the process. And if children would have given a chance to be supported within that reflection and recovery period, they would have gotten a positive decision that then would have benefited them with regards to protection in other procedures, such as in asylum, or perhaps children who are coming across a criminal justice system, either as victims of other crimes, or possibly as due to prosecution for offenses that they committed as a result of their exploitation. So this is a very troubling development for us. And we're very concerned about the impact that this will have on all child victims of trafficking. So this is not just going to affect children who have irregular immigration status, but all child victims of trafficking. And obviously, as April mentioned at the beginning, that includes a disproportionate number of British children who are exploited for criminal exploitation. That will be all children from all nationalities may just start being disqualified at this entry point. Then we move on to another clause in this part 5, which is the disqualification from protection. This clause is aiming to set out how people can be disqualified from the protection that is offered through the NRM because of public grounds. But the way that public grounds are defined in this clause makes it incredibly troubling. So, for example, the language in this disqualification clause states that any potential victim, including children, may be disqualified because they might have been referred into the NRM due to bad faith. But that really isn't defined. So there could be a lot of different interpretation there. And then there's other subsequent cases. So, for example, if children have had custodial sentences of 12 months, then they could be disqualified from protection. And this is very troubling because obviously, same as I've said with the previous clause, there's a disproportionate number of children who are being exploited for criminality, who may have served 12-month custodial sentences because they weren't identified as victims, but rather seen as offenders. And that would then subsequently compel the damage that was done with that lack of identification, because it would preclude them from being identified at all in the future. So that's another very troubling development in this bill. And then just to wrap up with the last two, there's then there's the subsequent provision for a set of immigration leave for confirmed victims of trafficking. So it would be those who at the end of the process have received a positive conclusive grounds decision. And in the world that this bill envisions, obviously they would have past kind of all the barriers that I just spoke about that have been said before you would even get to that stage of being granted immigration leave. But this immigration leave that the bill is talking about, especially for children, is also very troubling because it's only talking about a temporary form of leave. Whereas we all know that the type of immigration leave for children that is set out in the European Convention, which is what the government has said, this clause is attempting to give rise to, it specifically says that the only consideration for granting a residence permit to children is that it's in their best interest as a primary consideration. That's it. So children shouldn't be having to prove that they're cooperating with a police investigation, or that they're seeking compensation, or that it's in their due to personal circumstances, which can be really high bars. Just solely it's if it's in their best interest, and the length of leave should reflect that. There will be few cases where just granting this very temporary limited form of leave will really truly be in the child's best interest. And then just to wrap up, obviously part 4 of the bill has a lot of new developments around age assessments. And this will be really troubling for child victims of trafficking. Particularly because we have seen in the past that, for example, age disputes have led to some of the most horrific failings for child victims that I've come across. This will be, for example, children who end up in adult prison and then in adult immigration detention because of failings at the age assessment process. And really, a lot of the proposals that are set up in the bill will only make this worse. So I'm going to wrap up now and pass on to the lovely TB, who did this beautiful artwork. And I wanted to ask you a few questions about it, TB, because we're really interested to learn about the artwork that you produced for the report and some of the thinking that was behind it. Okay. So this piece is called The Unknown by TB. And TB, I was wondering if you could talk to us about the thought process that you had creating this piece and what we're trying to convey.
Of course, I created this piece to show my frustration, my anger, my sadness, because I had recently relapsed because due to the trafficking circumstances and everything I've been through that has been categorized or that has been discussed in this presentation, it's really taken a toll on my mental health. So I relapsed and I still wasn't recovering properly. And I just thought, let me just pour my heart and everything, my emotions into this artwork. So this is of a woman crying, and I decided to draw this woman with multi-face to show the different emotions I was feeling. And I used expressive lines to show how frustrated and overwhelmed I am, because I didn't want it to be perfect, because I wasn't feeling that great about my mental health. And this shows how disturbed I am. That's why I created this piece.
I think it's stunningly beautiful, and that really comes across to me. I don't know if you had particular thoughts about the types of colors that you used, and if you could walk us through those decisions.
Of course, and the red symbolizes like anger, and the yellow symbolizes like happiness, because although I was really frustrated, overwhelmed, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, which means that there's happiness coming my way. Happiness is coming my way. And the brown just symbolizes like earth, the colors and everything as we live in, to symbolize nature, and the blues to symbolize the river and all the tears that I've been crying. And the black is to make emphasis of what I'm feeling, to just make it more apparent, so like everyone will be able to see it. That's why I've used these colors.
That's amazing, and that really does come across. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about the unknown, or shall I move to the other amazing piece that you created for this
yes,
report?
the unknown just symbolizes all the children and adults who are going through trafficking, because it's not an easy thing to go through, and you have to live with it for the rest of your life. People think that, like, maybe when you get all of the services, it does help to improve your chances of having a stable, successful life, but you're scarred still. You live with the scars, and sometimes when I sleep, I get flashbacks of what happened to me. Like, I have to live with it. So although I'm in a better circumstances now, I still have to live with the scars. So it will never go away. A scar doesn't go, it heals, but it never goes away. It's still visible. So that's what I'm feeling right now. Although I'm in a better position, but you can never ever, the memory of you being trafficked will never go away. So that's why I urge people or everyone to be patient with everybody, because sometimes we have flashbacks, we have bad memories, we remember it, and it's really hard to contain ourselves. So this is a long-lasting thing, and the government needs to know that this is something they can fix. They can make somebody's life better by providing education, housing, as well as status, to make the person more comfortable, but they can't take away the person's experience, which needs a lot of therapy. They need to go through a lot of therapy, and I feel like the government needs to implement free therapy for people, young people or adults who have been trafficked, because that really helps a lot. So I tried that, and it really helped me a lot, and I'll continue to do it. So I urge everyone to just be a little. I want the government to be a little bit sensitive. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was spot on. And then we have here, TB, the other drawing that you did called Open Your Eyes. Did you want to talk to us a little bit about what you were thinking about when you were creating this?
Of course, when I initially drew this, I started to draw the eyes, because the eyes tell a story. The eyes tells where you've been. The eyes shows emotions. When you're crying, when you're upset, your eyes just react in a different way. And I drew an eye crying and I used red and blue to represent both genders of male and female that are being trafficked, as well as people who are who are in LGBTQ. It doesn't matter what sexuality or anything, because the government, I've noticed, the government refused to recognize people who are in the LGBTQ, people who are being trafficked. So it's really hard. So I just wanted to make an artist inclusive for everybody. And the I made the hand white, because I didn't want to specify a gender or a color or race, because most when being trafficked, that it doesn't matter about your race or nationality or religion. It's something that happens to human beings, and our color shouldn't take away our experiences or should, make our experiences worse. That's why I used white. I left the hand white, and the rope just symbolizes the struggles, the anxiety, the bondage of going through the whole trafficked experience. So that's why I came up with this drawing.
I think it's stunningly beautiful. Thank you so much for explaining all of that to us and going through all the decisions you made and the thought process. We really appreciate you being so generous with your time, TB.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move into the Q&A, and I'm just going to check out our chat box to see. So I think there's one first question here for you, April, and it's saying, do you think that the pandemic affected the issue of child trafficking? And is there any data to show this?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So you'll see from the snapshot report, we did include some data on the national referral mechanism and referrals for children. So despite the pandemic, we saw referrals continue to remain high. So there were 43.5% of all NRM referrals last year were for children. And that's even slightly up on the year before, which I think was 42.7. So there was that consistency in the high level of referrals. In terms of the impact, we know that many frontline organisations had to change their ways of working, and there were services that were moved online, and that obviously had an impact on the way that practitioners are able to engage with young people. There is a section in the report as well. We haven't covered it today, because we just didn't have the time. We tried to cram as much as we could in the 1 hour that we have, but there is a specific section in the report that looks at COVID-19 and has some quotes from young people, and actually it looks at from two different perspectives in some way. One person who said that actually being online opens up some opportunities for them, and they found it quite useful in some ways to be able to engage in online platforms, but for others, some of the kind of the challenges in that space. But Laura, I don't know if you've got anything to add on kind of ECPAT's experiences.
Yes, absolutely. I think that what we saw, and young people were telling us this as well, when for example, the DFE provided laptops to some of the young people we support later on in the year. This was, I think, late 2020. Some of them were still waiting early 2021. And we had some young people tell us, you know, we kind of needed some of this extra support all along. And it wasn't until the pandemic that maybe that was recognized, and some of those things were made available. So that was quite an interesting perspective from young people themselves, that we do share their quotes in the report. So I have a question for TB. I don't know, TB, if you feel up for answering a question, but we have a participant asking if you feel that, for example, expressing yourself through art helped you through the process as to where you're at now.
Yes, to be honest, I think ECPAT encouraged me to take my artwork seriously, because they saw how interested and how keen I am to just get to designing and drawing to express my emotions. And ECPAT was the front runners for, you know, pushing me to pursue a degree in fashion and textiles, because I always draw, but it's just I didn't have the confidence to do something about it. And now I'm using my talent to promote awareness of trafficking, which is really good for me, because it tells people my story, and that you can go through trafficking and come out of the other side. So this is to show positivity as well as bringing awareness. So it's really helped me. ECPAT has really helped me express myself through art. Yes.
Thanks so much for that, TV, and we're delighted that you were able to do these amazing drawings for us, and always keen to highlight your talent. So we have another question around part 5 of the bills, and obviously it has been actually Patricia, ECPAT UK CEO, who has been doing a lot of work on this bill. So Patricia, feel free to jump in also if you want to jump in on this question. So somebody, an attendee is asking, what are the key changes that you think should be made to part 5 of the Nationality and Borders Bill?
Thanks, Laura. Can you? Oh,
we can hear you and see you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry, a few technical issues. Yeah. I mean, overall, I'd just say there is so much sentiment across the whole of the anti-slavery sector and children's sector to say that really part 5 has no place in this bill. There are many things in this bill that have no place, but part 5 really conflates immigration with modern slavery, which is a completely backward step. On top of that, it ignores the protections that we need specifically for children and young people and child victims of trafficking and exploitation. So all of the measures that Laura highlighted have the same application currently to children and young people. So obviously that's quite a difficult task. We had some great debates in the House of Lords around the principles of the existing law, both international and domestic, in respect of modern slavery and also in respect of child protection. And we've got the report stage of the bill coming up, as you highlighted, next week, and probably the Tuesday the week after is when there'll be debates on part 5. There are some amendments down to try and both mitigate the worst of the impacts of part 5 on children, so exempt them from some of these effects. Also to put on the face of the bill the need for decision making that is solely in children's best interests, which is something that everyone working with children and young people understands should be at the heart and soul of everything that we do. And there are some wider amendments down, because obviously it's not good for anybody. We are championing the cause for children and young people, but there's so much widespread concern about it. I think Lord Debon said in debate that anybody who knows anything about this area of work disagrees with the government on this, and that's as simply as I can put it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Patricia. That was very generous. We have another question for you, April. So attendee is asking if you saw a spike in referrals for CSE, so that's child sexual exploitation, a few years ago, when this issue gained a lot more attention, as you're now seeing with criminal exploitation. Happy to answer that also, April, if you want.
Yeah, well, do you want to go in first and then I'll chip in with anything else? I guess from my perspective, I was just going to start off with the point that the NRM has only been around for kind of just over 10 years. We're still on, sorry, I've said you go first and then I've gone first, but feel free to cut in when you want to. I think we're still on a journey in terms of raising awareness on all the forms of exploitation. And I think we still wouldn't say that consistently children who are victims of CSE are actually being referred into the NRM in the same way that we're still seeing cases where victims of child criminal exploitation aren't being referred into the NRM. I think what we're also seeing, which is quite an interesting development as well, is individuals who are now adults being referred into the NRM who were victims of CSE as a child, and actually some of the conversations that are now going on around the kind of models of support within the NRM for adults, and whether that's kind of suitable to meet the needs of those who are now adults but have been exploited as children. So I'm not sure we saw necessarily the same spike, but Laura, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, I have to agree entirely with you. It is worth flagging that it hasn't been a long time that we've had an NRM. I think that one of the issues that a lot of people highlight to me is that for children that there's no immigration issues and they are not coming into contact with the criminal justice system either, as for example, for having committed offenses as a result of their exploitation. The way that the NRM has been structured within central government authority has really almost no benefit for children in the absence of those other processes, because obviously it's not a safeguarding decision that is taken at a local level. It doesn't lead to necessarily any increased resources for local authorities to help support children. So for that reason, it was never really seen as something beneficial to children. Hopefully that will change now as we move towards the devolved decision-making model. And obviously this has been one of the key drivers for ECPAT from the beginning, trying to compel the government to consider these types of models that center on child protection rather than this sort of binary trafficking decision that is made by central government, that often is completely detached and has, real little material impact for child victims. So I hope that answers your question. And unfortunately, we're 1 minute over. We have run out of time. But we really thank you all for coming. And thank you so much to TB and to April and to Patricia and the other ECPAT staff who really helped support webinar today, and we hope that it was informative for all of you who attended.